The Arctic Ocean, winter, 1942. There is no sunrise, only a dim smear of gray on the horizon, swallowed by snow and smoke. The convoy moves in silence, darkened ships cutting through black water thick with drifting ice. Frost clings to the railings, gun barrels are crusted white. Every step on deck is a gamble. One slip, and the sea takes you. A sailor grips the frozen steel of a 20-millimeter gun. His gloves are stiff. He cannot feel his fingers anymore. The wind slices through wool and leather as if they aren't there at all. Then, a flare. Green light blooms over the convoy, turning night into a ghostly daylight. Shadows stretch across the decks. For a heartbeat, every ship is exposed. Someone shouts. A torpedo wakes the sea. The explosion splits the darkness. A column of water and steel rising into the air. A merchant ship shudders, then lists hard to port. Men tumble across the deck. Another blast follows. Steam screams from ruptured pipes. Within minutes, the WWII ship begins to die. Lifeboats hit the water crooked. Some never launch at all. The sea temperature is below freezing. A man jumps. The shock steals his breath. His limbs lock. The oil-slick surface closes around him like iron. There will be no rescue. Not here. Not in this water. The convoy cannot stop. Engines strain. Rudders turn. The ships press forward into darkness, leaving burning wreckage behind. Somewhere beyond the snow and smoke, German submarines wait. And still, the convoy sails north. Because what lies inside those cargo holds is worth more than the lives now vanishing beneath the ice. The Arctic is killing them. But turning back is not an option. 7 months earlier, on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion force in human history surged across the Soviet border. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. Operation Barbarossa was not meant to be a campaign. It was meant to be an execution. In the first hours alone, Soviet airfields were obliterated. Entire squadrons burned on the ground before their engines ever started. Columns of German armor punched through unprepared defenses, moving so fast that Soviet commanders could not even locate their own front lines. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies were surrounded. At Minsk, gone. At Smolensk, shattered. At Kiev, over 500,000 men captured in one encirclement. Prisoners marched west in endless gray columns. Many would never return. The Red Army was not simply retreating, it was disintegrating. Factories in western Russia were dismantled in panic. Machinery loaded onto trains and hauled east toward the Urals. Civilians fled on foot. Roads clogged with soldiers, refugees, livestock, anything that could move. By autumn, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. To the outside world, the outcome seemed inevitable. The Soviet Union, vast, brutal, feared, appeared to be collapsing in a matter of months. In London, British intelligence assessments were blunt. If Moscow fell, the war in the East might end before winter. And if the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany would turn its full strength westward again. Britain had survived the Blitz. It had survived the Battle of Britain. But it could not survive a Europe completely dominated by Hitler, from the Atlantic to the Urals. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin faced a truth he had not imagined months earlier. His armies were bleeding out, his industry was uprooted, his reserves were thinning, and winter was coming. For the Soviet Union to survive, it needed time. Time to move factories, time to train new armies, time to stabilize the front, time that could only be bought with supplies, trucks, fuel, aluminum, food, weapons. Stalin sent urgent requests to Britain and the United States. The message was simple. Send everything you can, send it now. Because if the Soviet Union fell in 1941, the war would change forever. And to the north, beyond the reach of most maps, a narrow sea route waited, cold, violent, and exposed. It was the only way to deliver that time. In the summer of 1941, Britain was not strong, it was surviving. The Battle of Britain had ended only months earlier. London still carried the scars of the Blitz. At night, entire districts remained hollowed out, blackened brick and twisted steel standing where homes had once been. And beyond the coastline, another war raged unseen, the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Tankers burned on the horizon. Convoys vanished into cold gray water. Every ton of food, every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition Britain needed to stay alive had to cross that ocean under constant threat. The margin was razor thin. Now Stalin was demanding ships, not later. Now. Weapons, aircraft, raw materials. Churchill understood the stakes immediately. If the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany would gain oil, grain, manpower, and freedom to concentrate its full power against Britain. But sending aid was not a symbolic gesture. It meant diverting escorts from Atlantic convoys. It meant risking already overstretched destroyers in unfamiliar waters. It meant exposing British sailors to conditions few had ever faced. And there was another truth, one rarely spoken aloud. The Soviet Union was not an ally by choice. It had been a partner of Nazi Germany less than 2 years earlier. The Nazi-Soviet pact had carved up Poland. Trust between London and Moscow was thin, brittle, uneasy. Yet ideology no longer mattered. Strategy did. Churchill made his decision. "If Hitler invaded hell," he once remarked, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Britain would send aid, not because Stalin was trusted, not because the Soviet regime was admired, but because a burning Eastern Front was the only thing keeping Germany's armies from returning west. The question was not whether to send supplies. The question was how. The Atlantic was already a killing ground. The Mediterranean was contested. There remained only one route short enough, fast enough, and direct enough to matter. A narrow corridor through the Arctic, straight past German-occupied Norway, straight beneath the shadow of the Kriegsmarine. A route so dangerous that even experienced naval officers hesitated when they studied the maps. But time was running out. And somewhere north of Scotland, ships were already being loaded. On a map, the route looked almost simple. From British ports in Scotland and Iceland, straight north, past the Faroe Islands, across the Norwegian Sea, then east, skirting the frozen edge of the Barents Sea, toward 2 Soviet ports, Murmansk and Archangel. It was the shortest path between Britain and Russia, and the most exposed. To the south lay occupied Norway, transformed into a fortress of airfields, naval bases, and hidden fjords. German bombers could reach far out to sea. U-boats slipped in and out of Trondheim and Narvik, and somewhere in those icy inlets, the battleship Tirpitz waited, a silent threat powerful enough to scatter entire convoys without firing a shot. There would be no safe detours. In winter, darkness lasted almost around the clock, a thin advantage for concealment, but a nightmare for navigation. In summer, the opposite, endless daylight, nowhere to hide, every ship visible from miles away. The sea itself was unpredictable. Ice floes drifted without warning, storms rose from nowhere, charts were incomplete, compasses faltered so close to the magnetic pole. Yet, speed was essential. The longer the journey, the greater the risk. Supplies had to arrive quickly if they were to make any difference before the Soviet front collapsed. So convoys were organized, merchant ships packed tightly together, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and minesweepers. Slow ships forced to match the pace of the weakest hull among them. Each convoy received a code, PQJWRA, letters and numbers that would soon become synonymous with endurance and loss. In August 1941, the first convoy sailed. Its decks were stacked with crates, aircraft parts, ammunition, rubber, machine tools. Men stood along the rails as Scotland's coastline faded behind them. Ahead lay only gray water and colder air. They were not heading toward a battle in the traditional sense. They were sailing into a corridor where nature and enemy would merge into one. And once they passed north of Norway, there would be no turning back. Before the Germans ever attacked, the Arctic made its intentions clear. The cold was not simply uncomfortable, it was invasive. It crept through layers of wool and canvas, through gloves and boots, through skin and into bone. Breath froze in midair. Eyelashes crystallized. Metal burned like flame against bare fingers. On deck, men moved slowly, not from fear, but from stiffness. Every surface was slick with ice. Sea spray lashed against the hull and froze instantly, layering railings, cables, and gun mounts in thick white armor. If the ice grew too heavy on one side, a ship could list dangerously. So sailors fought the sea with hammers and axes. Hour after hour, they chipped away at frozen decks in gale-force winds, trying to keep their vessels upright. One misstep could mean sliding overboard into black water that killed in minutes. In winter, darkness swallowed the convoy for nearly 24 hours a day. There was no horizon, no stars visible through storm clouds, only the dim outlines of the ship ahead, if you were lucky. Navigation became guesswork wrapped in tension. A single mistake could scatter the formation or drive a ship into drifting pack ice. Then came the storms. Walls of wind tore across the Norwegian Sea without warning. Waves rose like moving cliffs, smashing into bows and rolling ships until propellers spun uselessly in the air. Convoys stretched and compressed under the strain, slower vessels fighting to stay in position. Below deck, engines groaned, pipes burst, compartments flooded. Men tried to sleep while the hull shuddered around them. Summer offered no mercy either. Instead of darkness, there was endless daylight, a white, blinding glare reflecting off water and ice. There would be no concealment, no night to hide within. The Arctic stripped away illusions. It did not care about strategy, alliances, or cargo. It did not care about the war. It punished weakness without discrimination. And every man aboard those ships understood something quickly. If the sea alone could do this much damage, what would happen when the enemy found them? By late 1941, the Germans understood exactly what the Arctic convoys represented. They were not isolated supply runs. They were arteries, and arteries could be severed. Occupied Norway became a forward operating base stretching hundreds of miles along the convoy route. Airfields at Banak and Kirkenes housed torpedo bombers trained specifically to hunt ships in narrow seas. Submarine pens in Trondheim sheltered U-boats that could slip into the Norwegian Sea undetected. And deep inside, cold fjords, under camouflage nets and anti-aircraft guns, heavy surface ships waited. The battleship Tirpitz. Her mere presence was enough to alter British strategy. She rarely needed to fire. The possibility that she might sortie forced the Royal Navy to allocate capital ships as distant cover for nearly every convoy. Every time a convoy sailed north, it did so under a shadow. U-boats were the first to strike. They hunted in loose packs spreading across likely routes, using reconnaissance aircraft to spot convoys from afar. Once contact was made, the submarines would stalk from beneath the waves, waiting for night or storm to close in. The Arctic made detection difficult. Convoys had to remain tightly grouped for protection. That tight formation, however, created a dense target. One torpedo could cripple a freighter loaded with tanks or ammunition, and, unlike in the Atlantic, evasive maneuvering was limited. Ice restricted sharp turns, visibility was poor, escorts were stretched thin. Then came the Luftwaffe. Twin-engine bombers appeared suddenly through cloud banks, flying low over the water. Torpedoes dropped at close range. Dive bombers screamed downward through flak bursts and snow squalls. The Arctic sky, so empty moments earlier, would erupt with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. Merchant sailors were not career combatants. Many had never seen battle before, 1941. Now they stood behind deck guns, firing into sleet and smoke at aircraft closing fast over freezing seas. The first losses were sobering. A ship hit would often burn fiercely in the cold air, flames rising stark against white snow. Survivors clung to wreckage, watching the convoy disappear over the horizon. Stopping meant risking the entire formation. Rescue was never guaranteed. As 1942 approached, the convoys grew larger. The cargo grew heavier, and so did the German response. One convoy in particular would test the entire strategy. Its code was PQ-17, and what happened to it would echo through every Arctic sailing that followed. In late June 1942, convoy PQ-17 left Iceland with 35 merchant ships. They carried nearly 300 aircraft, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and vast quantities of ammunition and fuel. Enough material to equip entire Soviet divisions. The escorts were strong, destroyers, corvettes, anti-aircraft ships, and distant cover from heavier Royal Navy units shadowed the convoy from afar. But intelligence reports soon began to circulate. The German battleship Tirpitz had left her anchorage. If she reached the convoy, the result could be annihilation. Tirpitz was not merely another surface raider. She was one of the most powerful battleships afloat. heavily armored, armed with massive guns capable of smashing merchant ships and their escorts alike. In London, fear spread through Admiralty headquarters. The Arctic offered no room for error. If a battleship intercepted the convoy in open water, there would be nowhere to hide. On July 4, 1942, a fateful order was transmitted. The close escort was to withdraw westward. The merchant ships were to scatter, individually, across hundreds of miles of exposed ocean. The intention was simple: make the convoy a less concentrated target. The effect was catastrophic. The escorts turned away. The merchant ships, now alone, steered into the fog and ice in separate directions, hoping distance might mean survival. Instead, they became isolated prey. German U-boats and aircraft descended on them one by one. There was no coordinated defense, no protective screen, no unified anti-aircraft fire. A freighter burning on the horizon, no longer, meant the rest of the convoy could respond. Each ship faced the Arctic and the enemy alone. Over the next days, submarines hunted methodically. Torpedoes struck without warning. Bombers attacked crippled ships repeatedly until they slipped beneath the surface. 24 of the 35 merchant ships were lost. Hundreds of sailors died. Some perished in explosions. Others drifted in lifeboats through freezing fog, waiting for rescue that might never come. The feared sortie of Tirpitz never fully materialized. She did not deliver the destruction London had anticipated. The damage had already been done, by fear, by uncertainty, by a single order. PQ-17 became a symbol of disaster. Critics called the Arctic route madness. If this was the cost, could the convoys continue, or had the gamble already failed? After PQ-17, the question hung over the Admiralty like Arctic fog. How many more ships could Britain afford to lose? How many more men could be left, drifting in black water? The answer depended on what those ships were carrying, because inside the holds of those battered freighters was not symbolic aid. It was mobility. It was industry. It was time. By war's end, the Arctic convoys, along with other Lend-Lease routes, would deliver more than 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. American-built Studebakers and Fords that could haul artillery, fuel, and infantry across distances that horses simply could not cover. The Red Army of 1941 had relied heavily on animal transport. The Red Army of 1944 would move on wheels. Those trucks pulled the guns that encircled German forces at Stalingrad. They towed anti-tank weapons into position at Kursk. They carried ammunition forward during the great offensives of 1944, when Soviet armies advanced not miles, but hundreds of miles, and trucks were only the beginning. Thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, locomotives to replace shattered rail networks, rails, machine, tools, aluminum, copper, high-octane aviation fuel that Soviet refineries struggled to produce in sufficient quantities, spam and tinned meat that fed soldiers when farmland lay under occupation, boots, radio equipment, explosives. The Arctic convoys did not win battles on their own, but they made sustained mechanized warfare possible. Without locomotives, rail lines remained broken. Without aluminum, aircraft production slowed. Without trucks, offensives stalled. Soviet factories were being rebuilt east of the Urals, but they needed raw materials and transport to function at scale. The convoys bridged that gap. They bought the Soviet Union the months it needed in 1941, and later they gave it the reach it needed to strike back, which meant that every ship burning in the Barents Sea carried more than cargo. It carried the future shape of the Eastern Front, and despite PQ-17, the ships kept sailing. By the winter of 1942, the story of the Eastern Front had changed. The German advance had stalled before Moscow. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, began to stabilize its lines. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia. Factories relocated beyond the Urals resumed production. But survival alone was not enough. To defeat Germany, the Soviet Union had to do more than endure. It had to move. At Stalingrad, that mobility became decisive. When Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, they struck not directly at the city, but at the flanks, smashing through weaker Romanian and Hungarian units guarding the German Sixth Army. Encirclement required coordination. Artillery had to be hauled into position. Fuel had to reach armored units at the right moment. Infantry needed transport to exploit breakthroughs before German reserves could respond. Much of that movement depended on vehicles that had not existed in 1941. American-built trucks rolled across frozen steppe, hauling guns and ammunition through snow and mud. They extended the operational reach of Soviet commanders who had once been constrained by horses and damaged railways. When the German Sixth Army was surrounded at Stalingrad, the ring that closed around it was not formed by manpower alone. It was sustained by logistics. The pattern repeated at Kursk in 1943. The largest tank battle in history required enormous reserves, not just of armor, but of fuel, shells, spare parts. Soviet defensive belts were layered deep, reinforced with anti-tank guns and mobile units positioned to counterattack. Behind the lines, transport columns worked relentlessly. Rail lines rebuilt with imported materials carried divisions forward. Locomotives supplied under Lend-Lease pulled endless freight trains east and west. Then came Operation Barbarossa in 1944, a vast offensive that shattered Germany's Army Group Center and pushed the front hundreds of miles westward. This was no longer a desperate defense. It was mechanized pursuit. Columns of trucks stretched along dusty roads, carrying supplies fast enough to maintain momentum. Soviet forces no longer paused for lack of transport. They advanced with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. The transformation was not solely due to foreign aid. Soviet industry had expanded dramatically, but the bridge between collapse and resurgence, between 1941 and 1943, had been reinforced by ships that sailed through Arctic storms. The convoys did not fight at Stalingrad. They did not fire at Kursk. Yet their cargo moved on those battlefields, and with each Soviet counteroffensive, the gamble in the Arctic began to look less like desperation and more like strategy. The Arctic convoys did more than strengthen the Red Army. They reshaped German strategy. From the moment the first convoys sailed, Berlin understood the threat. If Allied supplies continued to flow into Murmansk and Archangel, the Soviet Union would not collapse quickly. The war in the East would stretch on, and a long war was not the one Germany had planned for. So, Hitler made a decision. Norway would become a fortress. By 1942, hundreds of thousands of German troops were stationed there. Coastal batteries lined the fjords. Airfields were expanded. Anti-aircraft guns guarded naval bases buried deep in mountain inlets. All of it for a possibility. The possibility that a convoy might appear on the horizon. Surface ships like Tirpitz were kept in constant readiness. Submarines were allocated to northern patrols. Luftwaffe squadrons that could have reinforced other fronts were held in reserve to strike at Arctic shipping. Resources that might have strengthened operations in the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic, or even the Eastern Front itself, were tied down by the need to counter a supply route running through ice. And there was another consequence. Every time a convoy sailed, the Royal Navy responded in kind. Heavy British warships shadowed the route at a distance, prepared to intercept any German surface sortie. Aircraft carriers and battleships were drawn northward. The Arctic became a silent chessboard. Fleet movements dictated by intelligence reports, by rumors of battleship deployments, by intercepted signals. Entire naval formations maneuvered because of what might happen, not what had happened. In this way, the convoys achieved something beyond the cargo they delivered. They fixed German attention. They pinned divisions in Norway. They forced Hitler to defend a coastline thousands of miles long against a threat that was, at its core, logistical. A supply line running through frozen seas had become a strategic lever. And by 1944, as Soviet armies drove westward and Allied forces prepared to land in Normandy, Germany was fighting on every front at once, stretched thin, reacting instead of dictating. The Arctic convoys had not simply sustained the Soviet war effort, they had helped widen the war. Germany could no longer control. When the war ended, the Arctic grew quiet again. The convoys stopped sailing. The guns fell silent. The ice drifted as it always had, indifferent to the flags that had once crossed its waters. In London, Arctic veterans returned home without parades. There were no triumphant headlines for supply ships, no victory photographs of burning enemy capitals. Their war had been fought in darkness, in sleet, in long stretches of fear, punctuated by sudden violence. Many had lost friends whose graves were measured not in soil, but in latitude and longitude. Recognition came slowly. For years, the Arctic Service was treated as just another naval posting. Only decades later would formal medals and public acknowledgement begin to correct that oversight. In the Soviet Union, the silence was deeper. The official narrative of victory centered on sacrifice, industry, and the resilience of the Red Army. It celebrated Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Foreign aid was mentioned, but rarely emphasized. The political climate of the Cold War hardened memories. Former allies became rivals. Cooperation gave way to suspicion. It did not suit either side to dwell too long on the months when British and American ships had risked annihilation to keep Soviet armies supplied. Yet the numbers remained. Thousands of sailors had crossed the Arctic Circle under constant threat. Dozens of convoys had forced their way through ice and enemy patrols. Hundreds of ships had been lost. And beneath the surface of post-war politics lay a simple truth. When the Soviet Union stood on the brink in 1941, ships from the West sailed anyway. Their contribution did not fit neatly into ideological stories, but it helped shape the outcome of the largest war in human history. The Arctic does not remember names. It does not remember convoy codes or admirals' decisions. It does not remember the arguments in London or the telegrams sent from Moscow. It remembers only wind and ice. But the men who sailed there carried something the Arctic could not erase. On the decks of slow merchant ships, under skies that never fully brightened, they stood watch beside crates stamped with foreign markings. They chipped ice from steel railings. They scanned horizons for periscopes and aircraft that could appear without warning. Many were young. Some had never seen combat before the Arctic. They learned quickly. They learned the sound a torpedo makes when it strikes steel. They learned how fast a burning ship can vanish beneath freezing waves. They learned that rescue is sometimes impossible, and that duty means sailing on anyway. Convoy after convoy pushed north, through darkness, through endless daylight, through storms that tore apart formation and nerves alike. They sailed not for glory and not for territory. They sailed to buy time. Time for factories to relocate beyond the Urals. Time for new armies to form. Time for a nation on the brink to steady itself. When Soviet troops raised their flag over Berlin in 1945, few of those soldiers had ever seen the Arctic Sea. Yet, somewhere in the long chain of events that led to that moment, there had been ships moving through ice. There had been sailors standing at frozen guns. There had been men who did not come home. History often remembers the battles where armies collide. It remembers cities encircled and capitals captured. But sometimes, survival begins far from the battlefield. Sometimes it begins with engines straining in the cold and a convoy disappearing into polar night. If this story is worth remembering, help us continue telling the ones history nearly left behind.